The German officer, resplendent in his greatcoat, stood on the rise, overlooking an endless expanse of frozen plains. Moscow, the ultimate prize, was within reach, but the winter and the Soviets were waiting. Operation Barbarossa, 1941. The Eastern Front, a brutal stage upon which the fate of empires would be decided. But beneath the veneer of triumph, cracks were beginning to appear. The relentless advance, the vast distances, and the unforgiving Russian climate all conspired against the invaders. The world held its breath, awaiting the final act. Months earlier, the Wehrmacht had stormed into the Soviet Union. Tank divisions pierced deep into the heartland, infantry marched relentlessly, and the Luftwaffe reigned supreme. The initial shock of the invasion had shattered the Red Army, but the Soviet Union was proving a more formidable foe than anticipated, and the winter an even deadlier one. In Berlin, the High Command dismissed the growing concerns. Logistics were strained, yes, but victory was within grasp. The Soviets, they insisted, were broken, their armies shattered, their resolve crumbling. They underestimated the tenacity of the Red Army and the brutal power of the Russian winter. But in the vast, frozen expanse, a different story was unfolding. The Soviet soldier, hardened by years of hardship, faced the invaders with a stoicism born of desperation. Winter, the ultimate ally, was descending, and with it, a Soviet will to resist that the Germans had not foreseen. As the temperature plummeted, the advance ground to a halt. Tanks bogged down in mud that had now become an icy prison. Engines failed, supplies dwindled, and the soldiers, ill-equipped for the brutal cold, began to suffer. The promise of a swift victory began to fade. Then, the counteroffensive began. From the depths of the frozen wasteland, Soviet forces emerged, their movements masked by the swirling snow. They were not broken, they were ready. The German lines, stretched thin and exhausted, were caught off guard. The fires offered little warmth. The cold, a relentless enemy, sapped their strength, froze their weapons, and stole their morale. Artillery roared, the earth trembled, the German lines shattered under the relentless assault. The offensive, once so confident, was now in retreat. Operation Barbarossa's frozen reckoning had begun. The myth of invincibility was shattered. The course of the war irrevocably altered. The Eastern Front, a theatre of unimaginable brutality, was about to become the graveyard of the Wehrmacht's ambitions. The German advance, initially a blitzkrieg, had become a desperate struggle against the elements and the relentless resilience of the Eastern Front. Winter, a foe more formidable than any army, had arrived. But the Soviets had prepared, and now the counteroffensive was unleashed. They had pushed eastward, confident of victory. But the frost had bitten deep, the supply lines strained, and the Red Army, seemingly broken, was about to shatter the Wehrmacht's illusion of invincibility. Panic was beginning to claw at the German command. Communication lines, already stretched thin, were now choked by the blizzard and the relentless Soviet assaults. The situation was spiraling out of control. The Soviet infantry, hardened by months of brutal fighting, now surged forward. Driven by a desperate need to survive, they pressed the attack, exploiting every weakness in the German lines. The Soviets targeted the German logistical network. Fuel, food, and ammunition were cut off. The Wehrmacht, reliant on a complex supply chain, began to starve and freeze. The retreat began, a chaotic scramble for survival. The German war machine, once so formidable, was now crumbling under the relentless pressure. The illusion of invincibility had been shattered. The Soviet strategy was clear: encircle and destroy. Pockets of German resistance were isolated and overwhelmed. The noose was tightening. Specialized Soviet units, equipped for winter warfare, moved with deadly precision, striking deep behind German lines, disrupting communications and harassing supply routes. The reports filtered in: encirclements, dwindling supplies, and the relentless advance of the enemy. The German High Command was losing control of the situation. The winter's reckoning had arrived. The tide had turned. Operation Barbarossa's ambitions lay in ruins, buried beneath the snow. The Soviet winter counteroffensive had marked a turning point in the war, a moment when the world understood that the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht was vulnerable. The Eastern Front, already a cauldron of violence, now transformed into a frozen graveyard. The brutal winter had arrived, and with it, a reckoning. The offensive began, a counterattack of astonishing scale and ferocity. The relentless Soviet tanks, a steel tide, surged forward, shattering the illusion of German invincibility. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to swift victories, found itself faltering. The extreme cold crippled machinery and men alike. Their advance, once unstoppable, now ground to a halt. Desperate pleas crackled across the airwaves. Every dispatch painted a more dire picture. The situation was unraveling. The German command, far away, struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster. The tide had turned. Soviet soldiers, fueled by the desperation of their homeland and a newfound resolve, tasted victory. The red banner, a symbol of hope, was raised again. Supply lines, stretched thin and vulnerable, began to break. The frozen landscape offered little respite. Hunger and the cold gnawed at the German ranks. The logistics of war had failed. Retreat became the only option. The landscape, once a battlefield, now a killing ground. The dream of swift victory shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a desperate and brutal exodus. The biting grip of winter had arrived. But the cold was not the Germans' only enemy. From the east, a steel tide was rising. Wave after wave of Soviet reinforcements surged into the front lines, a human avalanche altering the very landscape of the war. The vaunted Wehrmacht, once masters of the blitzkrieg, began to crumble. The unstoppable advance had stalled. Now, a chilling transformation had begun. German soldiers, their resolve broken, laid down their arms. The collapse, swift and brutal, had begun. The map told a stark and unforgiving truth. The German front was fracturing. The meticulously planned invasion, Operation Barbarossa, was being devoured by the unforgiving Russian winter and a resurgent Red Army. Losses mounted exponentially. Men, machines, and the very dream of victory. Soviet tanks, forged in the fires of war and hardened by the cold, spearheaded the counteroffensive. Their relentless advance choked the German lines. The tide had turned, and the hunter was now the hunted. The German retreat became a desperate scramble for survival. German artillery, once a symbol of their devastating power, struggled to stem the tide. The frozen ground hampered their mobility, and ammunition was increasingly scarce. Their firepower, blunted and ineffective, could no longer halt the relentless Soviet onslaught. In the face of unimaginable hardship, camaraderie flourished. Soviet soldiers, having achieved a hard-fought victory, found solace in shared moments. They were united by a common purpose, fueled by a desire to liberate their homeland. They found strength in each other. The frozen earth bore witness to the devastating human cost. Across the vast battlefield, the fallen lay in frozen silence. A grim testament to the brutality of war, the unforgiving winter claimed lives with equal indifference. The cost was astronomical. Leadership, once the cornerstone of German military prowess, crumbled under the weight of defeat. Officers, now struggling to maintain order amid the chaos, found their authority undermined. Their calls for valor met with weary resignation. Their grip on the situation was slipping. With air superiority firmly in their grasp, Soviet forces unleashed a rain of terror from the skies. German columns, caught in the open, became easy targets. The Luftwaffe, outmatched and outgunned, could offer little resistance. The sky belonged to the Soviets. The vaunted supply lines, once the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, were severed. Hunger gnawed at the soldiers, a silent enemy as deadly as any bullet. The Russian winter, a weapon of unimaginable power, began its relentless siege. Logistics had crumbled. The pride of the German war machine, their tanks, were reduced to sitting ducks. Immobilized by the relentless snow, they became easy targets. The Soviet anti-tank weapons, once a threat, now found their mark with devastating precision. The advantage shifted dramatically. Behind enemy lines, the partisans emerged from the shadows. They disrupted supply routes, ambushed columns, and sowed chaos. Sabotage became a weapon, a constant threat that further eroded the Wehrmacht's strength. With renewed vigor, the Soviet onslaught continued. Their tanks, now unhindered, tore through the weakened German defenses. The advance was relentless, a force of nature that swept away all resistance. The Wehrmacht's position was collapsing. The relentless Russian winter had arrived, a brutal harbinger of doom. German soldiers, once masters of the blitzkrieg, now faced a foe far more formidable than any army: the cold. Survival became the sole imperative. The lifeline of the Wehrmacht was severed. Supply lines, stretched and vulnerable, were relentlessly targeted. The logistical arteries of the invasion were systematically choked, strangling the advance. The German advance had stalled, then fractured. What began as a lightning war devolved into a desperate flight. The vaunted Wehrmacht was in full retreat, its invincibility shattered. Liberation dawned. Soviet tanks rolled through towns and villages, bringing the promise of freedom. The tide had definitively turned. The invaders were being pushed back. The blitzkrieg's end. One man's gaze reflected the bitter truth. The dream of a swift victory had dissolved. The landscape now bore witness to a catastrophic miscalculation. The war had changed. The Soviet winter counteroffensive, a turning point. The Wehrmacht's advance was halted, their offensive shattered. The course of the war irrevocably altered. A new chapter had begun. The frozen reckoning had arrived.